I was visiting my friend Alistair on a winter's evening. It was then that the whole thing started. Alistair lived some 5 miles from my home where I lived with Janet. It was a walk by torchlight and in deep snow, although the night was clear. But I had not seen Alistair for many months, so I considered the lengthy walk worthwhile. I remember he had cooked a haggis. We set to eating right away. There followed biscuits with a variety of cheeses, and of course the whisky. After the long walk and the heavy meal, the whisky was welcome. Alistair and I had sat by his small fireplace, watching the logs crackle in the stove and catching up on each other's news. It was then that he used the word. "What we need, Angus, is a little more re-enchantment." Re-enchantment. This is not a word that any Highland man would think to be using. I had always thought of the mind of a Highlander as being as clear and straightforward as the fresh snow I had walked through on my way to Alistair's bothy. But here he was befuddling things with strange thoughts. Perhaps it was the whisky, but I had to ask him. "What is it that you mean by that, Alistair?" I asked cautiously. "Well," said Alistair, seeming to warm to his subject, "time was that an Edinburgh squirrel could travel all the way to London without touching the ground." I was astonished. "Now, Alistair," I said, "why on earth would an Edinburgh squirrel want to go to London? Is it not bad enough for a squirrel to be living in Edinburgh?" Alistair shook his head. No, Angus, you're missing the point. The point is that there were trees all the way, a continuous forest." This had caught my attention. "Forest over most of England?" I asked. "Yes, that's right," Alistair replied. "And at that time Scotland too. That's what we've lost." "I never knew that, Alistair. So what is this re-enchantment you speak of?" "Well, have you noticed the changes over the last few years? The beaches we played on as wee boys are washed away. The glens are flooded. When it rains, the rain comes in torrents. We have heat waves that no one has ever witnessed before. And then the snowstorms like today." "It's the government's fault," I said, but feeling unsure of myself. "They should fix it." "Governments can't do much unless people really want change," Alistair replied. "It's down to us. We need to re-enchant." There it was, that word again. What did Alistair mean? "Think about it, Angus. But now you must be off home to Janet." So I departed for the long trudge back home, but in truth I hardly noticed the walk, as my mind was so taken up with what Alistair had said. Forest, over the whole of Scotland. I reached home and went at once to bed. I lay beside Janet, both of us in our vests and with 3 downies, our normal winter bedding arrangements. "Janet," I said in the darkness, "Alistair said something strange tonight." "What did he say, Angus?" she responded. "He used a strange word, re-enchantment." Janet made no response, so I continued. "Do you know what it means, Janet?" "Angus," Janet replied at last, "what is it I've been telling you for a good many years now?" "Is it about putting out the bins correctly, Janet?" I responded. "No, Angus, it's about the trees and the flowers, the birds, the animals, the insects." "What about them, Janet?" "They're all gone, Angus," said Janet, and the truth was beginning to sink in. "We need to bring them back. We need to love them almost as if they were our own skin. That's re-enchantment, Angus. That's what Alistair was meaning." I lay in silence in the darkness, as the full impact of what Alistair and then Janet had been telling me sank in. Forest, animals, birds, insects, flowers. How could we ever have thought to live without those things? How could we ever have let this happen? I resolved that night to try to put things right, at least in our own little corner of the world. I would visit Alistair again in the morning, and together we would make a start. Well, that night is now some 40 years in the past, in 2032, and of course my readers will be aware of all the changes that have taken place in the world since then. Wars raged across the planet until finally it seemed there was nothing left to fight about, and the great diaspora, as we now call it, settled down into their new homes in Antarctica and the lands close to the North Pole. We were forced into self-sufficiency for the most part. Scotland, more or less, has no mainland to speak of. We are just a cluster of islands, known now as the Caledonian Archipelago. And here in Caledonia we are lucky, or should I say, we were prudent, for Alistair and I had worked tirelessly throughout those terrible decades, finding the right species of tree, plant and animal to bring our land and learning all we could of farming, food crops and animal husbandry to take us through what we knew was coming. We have now what was once described as a Mediterranean climate, with all the trees and crops that grow along with that. Olive groves, vineyards, orchards of peaches, apricots, plums, apples. A wild forest covers most of our islands, with wild creatures in its midst. Despite all our woes, the land is re-enchanted. I am lying awake with Janet beside me in bed. We are oldsters now, but nonetheless we lie naked beneath a single sheet. "What are you thinking, Angus?" says Janet at my side. There is the chirrup of insects from outside the open window, and I check that the mosquito net is tucked in around our mattress. "I'm thinking that we did it," I say. A swooshing sound from the long grass as a herd of deer passes near the house, then the hoot of an owl. "What, Angus? What did we do?" "This," I reply. "This is what we did. Re-enchantment." Janet gives a low chuckle, almost as if she had known all along how things would turn out. Then she turns on her side and goes to sleep.